Good, good, good.
I think that's been my journey also. So I find it it's a little affinity with people.
Yes, yes. Good.
Okay, so we are live.
Mhm.
Um, First of all, welcome to everybody to this particular segment of Winning Minds. We are an inspirational storytelling platform, and the whole idea is to bring together to you content creators who write or create content across genres, whether it's short stories, fiction, blogs, video, video logs, um, and so on, so that you can unpick and unpack their minds and learn about creativity, learn from their journeys, and be inspired. It's part of Women Inspiring Network, which is a paid forward movement. And we've garnered more than 10 million views since lockdown across the different events and segments that we've held. And again, the whole idea is to make sure that each and every one of you leaves today's conversation energized and inspired. So, with that, let me welcome Indira Chandrasekhar, our guest for today. Indira, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful to have you. So, let me just introduce Indira briefly. Indira is a scientist, she's also a fiction writer, and she's been the founder and principal editor of Out of Print, which is it's a 10-year journey that Out of Print has completed as a digital platform, bringing together short stories from authors around the world. And Indra has she lived around the world for 17 years. She has a PhD in biophysics, and she worked in that area of science and innovation and discovery and so on for many years in the US, in Switzerland, and in India. But today we are here in her literary avatar to talk about her two books, Polymorphism, which was her book of short stories, and Out of Print, which has, I think it's the new one. Um, and that's, I think it's a collection from Out of Print, the site, and some of the best stories that Indra has curated over the years are in this book. Right? So again, Indra, welcome again to our show, and so wonderful to have you here. So let's begin, Indra, a little bit trying to understand your motivations and drivers and how you actually got started into this journey, given the fact that you are a trained physicist with a PhD in the subject. Obviously, it's a lot of education in a very complex and dense scientific stream. So, how did you get interested in creativity? Was it from the start? What was your early childhood like? What were the motivations like? Let's talk a bit about that.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. And before I even talk about it, I would just like to thank Context and Western Amazon for bringing me together with you. They are the publishers of the 10-year anthology. And I'm doing it in the beginning so that when we get into our conversation, I don't forget, in the end. So, yes, the thing is, I had been a scientist for many years. And in fact, even the cover of Polymorphism, which is my collection of short fiction, uses a scientific image as the cover. It's muscle networks being built by stem cells, and which is work that was done by a friend of mine. And I asked her for some images, and that's what it uses. So I'd been a scientist for many years, and obviously I found it very exciting and very creative, actually, even though you're looking at masses of data. I did a lot of computer simulation work. So you're looking at masses of data and trying to make sense of it and trying to make, put it into the world of biology, even as you look at raw data coming off of a computer. What is the connection? And I loved doing it. And I had lived abroad, but when we moved back to India, which was wonderfully exciting, and we moved to Mumbai, to Bombay, which I had never lived in before, only visited, suddenly it was as if my soul was awakened a little bit. So I used to always love telling stories. I loved telling my children's stories. My grandmother, my aunts were all great storytellers, my mother. So I sort of grew up with that inspiration of storytelling always around me, from the myths to family stories to just, fun stories that people used to tell. And suddenly I became a storyteller. And I needed to express these stories that were coming up from within me. It's as if they had stayed dormant for many years and were just waiting for the lid to be opened. And at the time, I had two possibilities for working in science in very good labs out of Mumbai. And I thought, well, maybe it's time to take a small sabbatical so that I can examine what this other part of me that's waking up is all about. And so then that's how it all began.
No, it's fantastic, and as you're saying that it was there somewhere through the storytelling that runs through generations in your family, and
Yeah.
it sort of
Yeah.
came back. So when it's always a challenge growing up in India when you're told, okay, follow a particular path,
Mhm.
and to deviate from that path requires a lot of courage, right? Which you obviously have successfully traversed this path as well. So when you look at young girls today who are pursuing careers in science and technology, but have a creative bent of mind, whether it is for music, whether it's for art, whether it is for creative writing, whatever it might be, what would you suggest to them? Should they balance things out? Should they pace things out in the sense that do it sequentially? Should they dive in?
I think it's very individual. First of all, I should say I was very lucky. I chose to do science. My father was a scientist, my mother was an artist and continues to write even. And so I was, I had an exposure to both. And so I appreciate and grant that I was lucky in being able to do this. And I think, therefore, it was, while it does take, yes, it does take sort of personal courage and commitment in a way, I should admit, to even take that step despite all the support. I think it's even tougher when you don't have the support, or if you have not necessarily lack of support, but a sort of a pressure or a commitment to something else.
Mhm.
I think it is very difficult. One thing to keep in mind is from pragmatic point of view, it's very hard to make a living as an artist. And so if you have training in another field, I think it is valuable to be able to just earn your living from that. And I think most women now earn their livings. And so that is something that you really have to hang on to and value, that independence it gives you. Financial independence gives you creative independence. But then the balance comes in creating space in your mind to be able to be creative, because that is a very demanding thing. So you have to eke out a time. And I think for me, like for many women, when you're running a job and you have small children and you're also trying to do various creative things, it's a question of discipline too. You find that you end up earmarking time, allocating time for yourself, hidden time. There is a writer called Salma. She's from Tamil Nadu and she writes in Tamil. She talks about how when she first started writing, and she did not really get family support at all, and now she's like an incredible sort of entity. And she said she used to go after everyone went to bed. She would go and hide in the bathroom and write, And so I think you have to find a place in which to express that creativity somehow. That I think is the only way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think I was listening to Isabella Allende once, and I think she had these stories as well of
Yeah.
how she wrote when her children were young and
Yeah.
finding the time, to be able to do that, and the
Yeah.
space to be able to do that. Sometimes space is also a constraint,
Yeah.
both the physical space and the mental space.
Exactly. Exactly. Completely true. Yes.
So, do you think, in your journey, the scientific discipline and the training that you had played a role in creating this, this disciplined approach towards writing?
Yes and no. I think the scientific training very much is important in the way I'm able to structure my own writing.
Mhm.
It's also very important in being able to administer things like out of print or even creating the anthology. You know, it requires a fair amount of structure. Um, but as a young scientist, I was quite spoiled. You know, I would, of course, there were 9 to 5 hours when you were in the lab, but the rest of the time, sometimes I would work late into the night. I didn't necessarily have a commitment in the morning. If I had a teaching commitment, which was very unusual, mostly I was doing only research, then of course you sort of manage that. But otherwise, I was a little bit indulgent. I think it was the children that really changed my life because then they have schedules that are not that flexible, so you have to really be very sort of disciplined. I think that's, yeah.
Yes, yes. I think like, we've all been through that, right? What
Yes,
we take for granted in our own journeys, we have to
yes,
adapt to, in the
yes,
journeys of
exactly.
children. Yeah.
Yes.
So, Indra, let's talk a little bit about Indra the writer. And I was seeing, a lot of adjectives being used to describe, like, your writings, and I mean, it goes all the way from, okay, it's very real to it's very surreal, right?
Yes.
It says that it's, it could be an everyday person, an everyday story. It could be me, it could be you, it could be like, my neighbor. But at the same time, there is always a twist, which makes it very different,
Mhm.
right? You're emotionally connecting because these are all, and there's a lot of like, pathos in poignancy in many of these stories, but they're also disturbing because there's, yeah, I mean, like, there's this sadness, there is despair, there's like, tough emotions in many of these stories, right? So how do you get the inspiration for your stories, and uh, how do they come about?
Yes.
What's the
I
wisdom?
think the multiplicity of things. One is, of course, just observation, daily observation. I think living in Mumbai, it's again the seething city. You look out your car window or your train window, what have you. There are multiple human stories that are just in your face all the time. Or not even the architecture tells a story oftentimes. And so there's that, which is just observation and then allowing your imagination to take the story somewhere. I think in the early days, they were often just very organic, the way my stories evolved. Now, sometimes I think a little more about the themes or what I want to speak about. Um, then the other inspiration, of course, are family stories, you know, because I think families are incredible things. There are so many inspirations, there's so much support, but there's also, especially if you go back generations and not that far either, there are so many stories of injustice, of imposed patriarchy, of a woman in the family who might have just blossomed into something but couldn't because of this, that, or the other. And so all of those are also stories for me. And then there's science. And so science is very inspiring. So, in fact, if I could read a little tiny bit, I can sort of maybe illustrate what I mean by,
Absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely, please.
So one of the things that always interests me is about differentiation and selection. And so differentiation is really, you know, how do you go from two little cells and one of them decides to be a face and the other decides to be a stomach, you know? So how does that happen? The whole magic and the whole process of it. And from that sort of process of differentiation, I also think about selection, which is, so you move to a macro level and you think of siblings or even twins who are often so different in personality and yet so similar. So nature and nurture have been similar for them, and yet they're quite different. And that takes me also to the next level of selection, which is the idea of in vitro fertilization and how do you select the cells that survive. And so I was thinking about all of that, and I wrote this story, which is called A Leonard Jones Potential, and it's a little potential. It's a term for a little way of describing energy and the attraction between molecules. And it's told from the point of view of a young girl who is one of two twins. And this is how it goes. So she's just come out of her bath and she says, every footstep was another adventure. It was impossible to predict where the drops leaving her toes would land. Her heels, however, made distinct pear-shaped marks on the floor, as if they were shallow energy wells rooting her temporarily to the ground. Ma had shown her pictures, contour maps of energy wells, Leonard Jones potentials, she had called them, weak bonds, minute attractions between molecules. I'm weakly bonded to the earth, Kanaka thought. She squatted and looked at the water droplets on the floor. The drop that had splashed off her big toe had made a further series of small pear shapes. Were they made by the ghosts of my dead sisters, who Ma said had died before Renuka and I were born? Kanaka imagined them floating in a petri dish in liquid from their mother's stomach, feeble and small, next to Renuka and herself. Ma said that if they had all been allowed to survive, they would have been 7 sisters in all. Maybe one of them would have been just like me, Kanaka thought. What would they have been named? Would they all have had names that ended in ka, like Janaka, for example? But Janaka, that's a man's name, Sita's foster father. Pa is our foster father. She and Renuka didn't know who their real father was, only that it wasn't Pa, and that whoever it was had given his DNA to Ma to make them. They didn't know who he was. So anyway, it's sort of exploring the idea of selection, of a young child trying to make sense of it all. But it interests me, and so that's why I wrote that story.
And it's fascinating, like, how you drop in Leonard's potential, but like, you sort of like, like look at it from weak bonds, and you build on the idea in words and images that connect with everybody, right? Like, the feeble interactions and like, things like that, like, which anybody can get, but you're coming from that scientific stream. So really fascinating. But tell me a little bit, like, you mentioned something about, you've started thinking about themes now rather than stories from individual inspiration. So when you think through themes, what about the human condition? Is it the hope, or is it the complexity and challenge of life that inspires you? And how do you then, project that theme into a story or a series of stories?
Oh, that's a complicated question. Yes, I think, and a good one actually. I'm glad to be able to think about it out loud. Really, yes, I think it is the complexity. I mean, I don't like to have stories without any sense of hope. It's not that I always have closure in my stories. Often my stories are left open-ended. So the first one, polymorphism, in the collection Polymorphism, is in fact about a mother who is entering some sort of different phase, be it real or imaginary, and then how is she going to respond to her children? And I think that I leave it open-ended. But I don't like to leave stories hopeless and dark. I think that there is always a sense of the human condition is instilled in hope, or we would never really keep going, I think. So I like that idea of hope being a part of the narrative. But I think the way in which I approach it really is often from a very intimate or a personal point of view. I think it's the character who begins to tell the story and examine the theme. And the theme, yes, I have to admit, often it is connected to patriarchy, to matriarchy, in the sense of, or the maternal instinct of new generations. All of those themes come into play in mine. But then there's also always the underlying aspect of the politics of what's going on around. And I'm not a political writer in that sense. Some people have the politics at the forefront of their work. For me, I think it's always a sort of an underlying landscape that only very occasionally enters covertly into the story. Usually it's sort of hidden.
And there's the art of writing a good short story. is very different from, writing long fiction.
Yes.
And I mean, you have a limited landscape in which you need to bring together the entire story, but there also needs to be that moment, right?
Mhm.
That moment where you say,
Mhm.
okay, something happened. This is
Yes.
different. Right? So how do you craft that? Like, is there, do you follow a process from the idea and the inspiration and the setting that you said, is coming from multiple sources, the themes are there, but when you actually start crafting it, what's the process? And
Uh,
what's that turning point?
Yes, short stories are very difficult to write. It's true. I think because people think that there are a whole range of short stories. You can have any kind, but people often assume that because it's short, it's light, but it's not. In fact, they're very intense and they carry a lot of emotional impact often. And because you're putting very much into a few number of words. And so often you have to sort of recover in a way from reading a short story because it's a whole experience in itself. So I love this quotation that I, in fact, have used in the Art of Print introduction. Sorry, I'm just trying to find it. And it's called, it's introduction that, I'm sorry, a quotation that is from a French writer and academic called Christine Meunier. And she's writing an analysis of Virginia Woolf's short stories. And she says, she calls the short story an art of brevity and honesty. And I always like that phrase. I think it's very, very telling and very really encapsulates in a sense the idea of a short story, because when a short story doesn't have that integrity, you can really sense it. A reader can sense it. It feels like it's not it's so quick, it's so short that you can tell that someone's not telling it with honesty. In terms of craft, yes, I worked very hard at the craft because I started off, as I told you, as a storyteller. Suddenly I wanted to tell these stories. And I think the two things helped me. I started reading a lot of short stories. And I think over time that continues to help me because with Out of Print, we get a number of submissions. And many of them are very, very good and often translated works from really brilliant writers like Anant Murthy or Munshi Premchand. And so, you really have the privilege of being able to read beautifully crafted stories. So that's always a guide. It always tells you what you can do with a short story and what works. Now, the other thing was workshopping. I worked with a lot of groups of writers who were, you have to look around to find workshops at your level or that are giving you what you want. But then the peer interaction is very helpful. It really does help you examine your own work. And sometimes you think you've got something across, but you haven't. And I think a very important, apart from the emotional honesty that you need to hold in a story, I would say a very important aspect is sort of become almost like a mantra of short fiction, which is show and don't tell, which is don't say that the writer was feeling agitated, but say it through their dialogue, maybe. And that I think is something that you have to keep on looking at your work and saying, "Oh, have I overwritten it?" And letting go of it when it's not quite right. It's hard work.
I think, as you rightly said, a short story is a lot more intense than, uh, like a novel
Mhm.
is, right? And that turning point in the story.
Mm.
Do you have that in mind before you write, or does it happen organically for you? I mean, does the story emerge and then you say, okay, what should it pivot on?
Mhm.
Or is it that, you have a pivotal moment in your mind and then the rest of the story gets crafted around it?
I think more and more I have the pivotal moment in my mind because the minute you're sort of identifying the theme, you kind of figure out how you're going to tell the story. Of course, sometimes it changes because you create this character and suddenly the way in which you're saying something isn't anymore, doesn't have that integrity to the character anymore. So the story evolves or changes. But more often than not, I think you have some idea of where the story will make a transition or where the story will carry the focal point. And in fact, I've just finished writing a story. I'm a very slow writer. So I start a story and then I tell it and then I think, oh no, and I let it rest and I go back to it. So it's an old story that I've revived and I just sort of more or less I've finished it. And there, in a way, although there's a hint of all the conflict that's driving the main character, the actual punchline, if you want to call it that, really happens only at the end, you know. And so there are a couple of stories where I've done that. More usually it's kind of more towards the end, but not quite at the end.
So there is a resolution or a partial resolution then after that.
Yes. Yes. So resolutions maybe not my strong point. I usually leave it hanging for the reader to figure out. Or use their imagination.
The passage that you read out was obviously very nicely showcasing in the whole spirit of show don't tell, how you look and infuse scientific words or phrases into the stories. Now, I mean, there's other descriptions that I'm seeing, which are about clotted pathways of Carmen blood, and I think you talked about the Leonard Jones potential, but also talking about breathing and comparing breathing to monsoon and diaphragm and pressures. So does the imagery that you're trying to evoke, does the story come first for you, and then you say in the setting of this story this imagery will go well, or is there does science actually begin the idea or the germ of the story?
So the imagery is certainly quite an organic thing. It's as you write, it's part of the creative process in a way. You know, sometimes you don't even know where it's coming from. As you start to write, the story's evolving in your head and the words go down and you create the sort of the picture story part of it. Some writers write such beautiful landscape into their stories. You know, they have such beautiful settings. So in Out of Print, I have these fantastic stories, some of them where I'm so envious because they can just create the whole space in which you are. Mine tend to be very focused more on the immediate setting. I'm working towards opening out into wider landscapes, and I don't know if it'll succeed, and maybe it's just not my thing, but I kind of like the idea of, just building up this picture of a garden and, all of that sort of thing. But the imagery, which actually is resonating with the story, the imagery that's actually sort of carrying the story with it in sort of simultaneous narrative, that comes as I write. That comes as I'm telling the story. And that's part of the evolution, I think, also of the character in the story. And I thank you for that question because I don't think I'd really thought about it quite so explicitly before. So it's nice to realize that.
No, and I think you talk a lot about, when you talk about landscapes, one is the external landscape, but I think you do dwell on the internal landscape a lot. And yes. That perhaps then, defines a lot of what you're writing.
Yes.
And style.
Yes, yeah. I think that is true. Yes, thank you for that.
So you mentioned very curiously that you're a slow writer. So tell us a little bit about that process. Is it, how long does it take? Is it weeks? It's months? Do you do a lot of revisions? Do you edit yourself multiple times? What's the process for you?
Yes, very much all of the above, really. Nowadays I do have to write shorter things for other spaces. I mean, not just short fiction, but I write little things for the Out of Print blog, and then occasionally you have, I'm mentoring another magazine. I've got the lofty title of mentor editor now. And so for those, when I write, it's a different process. But when I'm writing a short story, it's very much, I put down the first flow of the short story. And even that takes me a little bit of time, because I write not in long spurts, but short things. I go back to, and that returning and cycling through the first few paragraphs or pages lets you evolve the story. And then as I said, I let it rest. And I go back and I revise and I look at it again. I do have a couple of trusted readers with whom I share as well. And that's always encouraging, because they're very good short story writers or readers themselves. And so it kind of, their feedback, which I don't always take into account, but their feedback just is encouraging. And then I let the story rest and I go back to it. And so I do have quite a long process. But once it's out, once it's published somewhere in a literary anthology or a literary magazine, then I let it go, because otherwise you can't stop revising.
Absolutely. So I think anthologies perhaps work slightly differently from a traditional publishing house. And how does that process work for you when writing a short story? Because it's written, as you said, with such brevity, with such honesty, and with such intensity, that when the editor comes in and they have, it's a creative process, right? It's a joint creative process, and they have a lens. And that lens obviously has to have some synchronicity, so that it's a positive process. But that lens also will have some things which will be different from the way that you thought through about the story. So how does that editorial process work when you're looking at a short story?
So I can answer it both as a writer and as an editor myself. I think that will sort of give you both perspectives. So I have to say, with Polymorphism, I didn't have I had some editorial input, which was very useful. And there was also a good editorial input on whether to include a couple of the other stories I'd written. And, so not just in the editing of the work itself, but also in the putting the collection together. So that was very useful indeed. But overall, there was not too much pushback on my work per se. As an editor, I'm a very engaged, and the Out of Print team is a very engaged. So we work very strongly with working with people's writing and really trying to help with the crafting of the story. I mean, often the work is really already there, and it needs very little, just a little bit of copy editing or something. But because we're an online space, and I think now there are many online spaces, but when we started, there weren't that many. It felt very accessible to young writers, I think. So we had a lot of young writers submitting their work, and wonderful, passionate stories, and sometimes needing a little bit of input on craft. And I think that input on craft, both in terms of structuring, in terms of seeing what your emotional strand is, what the sort of psychology of your story is, I think that we are quite strong with that. And also with language. I think with language also, it's interesting because you have a whole range of work, and then also we get a lot of translated work. So a translator's job is so difficult. You're listening to the original language and putting it into another. And so sometimes for an editor, you're one step away from it. So you're able to say, okay, that does sound like the original language, but in English, it doesn't sound maybe quite as smooth. And process. And I am most receptive to editorial input. As I said, I have a set of trusted readers. I've workshopped with a number of people, so that helps me. And most people, I find, don't push back. They are open and receptive to editorial input. Of course, there is a pushback a little bit sometimes, and I respect that because the writer says, yes, okay, that's what you're saying, but this is what I meant. And so we work, engage with it, and we work towards finding the best solution, or the best solution that's it's their work in the end. So
Sure.
we have to respect that.
Sure.
But just to close, I think editors are critically important. I think a good editor is fantastic to have. And with the anthology, I have to say, I was very lucky because I worked with Ajita GS, and she is from Western Amazon now. And she and Karthika have also brought, were the ones who actually commissioned a polymorphism. And that was really, really interesting because her input was superb, you know, light and to the point. And so, yes, I respect that. So even though these stories had all already been edited once without a print, we went through a second process where I worked with them, and then Ajita then came in with her thoughts. And so, yeah, I love editors.
No, that's fantastic. And I think you talked a little bit about translations, and translations, especially like, when you're looking at translating from the variety of Indian languages into English. Each language has its own cadence. Like, there's a rhythm, there's a there's a way in which the words are strung together, which doesn't always translate,
Yes.
easily.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yes. Well,
completely.
first of all, I'm so grateful to all the translators because without them, I would not be able to read so many of those stories, and so many of the readers wouldn't be able to either. And as you say, we're such a complex, multilingual country, and not just the country. If you think of the subcontinent, you know, and we have so many languages and so many regional variations in language. I mean, in Karnataka, for example, if you go from Bangalore to Bellary, it's, you know, the whole language and the pacing is so different. And the dialectical sort of changes that take place are extraordinarily strong. Um, Yes, and so translating into English, which is, again, of course, a very complex and regionally variable language, but just doesn't have many of the nuances, I think, is not an easy thing to do at all. And so I'm really, really grateful. And some translators are terribly accomplished at turning. I'm almost thinking, and this I don't even know if I should say it out loud, but I will. But I think that some translators who've lived in both languages simultaneously work differently than those who have learned another language and are translating into English. And there are different nuances in the way they translate. Both are fantastic. But the key is really, in the end, to make it readable in English as well. So even though you're always referencing, you're informed by the cadence of the original language. And sometimes I don't know the original language. Of course, being an Indian, I'm exposed to all the multiple sounds, but I don't know every language, obviously. And so, or I don't know it in a literary way. I might just know it in a kind of casual, ungrammatical Mumbai Hindi kind of way, you know. And so, so then but you still hear it. You still have an exposure to the sound and the nuance. But it has, in the end, to be very accessible to an English reader as well. So it can't, while it must express that cadence, it must be also readable. I think that's the key. I was recently talking to at the Kalakora Arts Festival, where I curate literature. I was talking to 3 translators, Arshia Satar, Audrey Trushka, and Supriya Gandhi, all of whom have worked with different levels of translation. And they were commenting on the fact that every 10 years, you sometimes need a new translation because language has changed, you know, English or whatever the translated into language has also changed. And so for a contemporary reader, you need a new translation.
And I think the sensibilities also change, right? Like, so if you need to attract the next generation of readers, you need to retell the story in a different light.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's right.
So let's talk a little bit about your editorial lens, or I mean not in the sense of like editing a story, but in the sense of actually identifying, okay, these are the stories that I want to put on the blog, on like on out of print, the digital platform.
Yes.
And so how does that sort of selection happen? And since you mentioned differentiation, I'm
Yes.
sure like you have to figure out like there has to be a balance of within short stories,
Mhm.
like like genre settings, themes, moods. So how do you balance out the platform and how you select for it?
Yes, yes, curation is an interesting thing. I mean, we get a lot of submissions, and in a way, I don't usually run themed issues with the out of print journal. We've run one on mythology, we've run one on sexual and gender violence soon after the Delhi episode with Jyoti Singh, which was a terrible,
Yeah.
terrible thing, really. And which hasn't stopped in many ways, which is, and I think we've, otherwise we don't really, and then we run ones on translation from a particular language. But most of the time we don't run themed issues because I do want to show kind of the diversity and range with each curated issue. I want to show the diversity and range of the work that's coming in and of what people are writing and thinking about. However, I think there's always an underlying, one is a human being, so one is never completely objective. And perhaps I don't want to be either. So there one's own politics, one's attitude to women, one's attitude to patriarchy, to particular political injustice which might be taking place at that moment, or social injustice. That tends to inform my selection process as well, and that of my team. And yeah, and during COVID, for example, we had a number of stories that came in which were about isolation and which were about the stress of living on your own or the craziness that happens because of that. And so those are stories that interested us immediately because they're so topical. They're what people are feeling and thinking now. So one's editorial lens is informed by the contemporary. And then ultimately, it's not necessarily about language because I do recognize that people are coming from so many multiple backgrounds. And so it's not that they have to write perfect English, whatever that might be. It's more about the ability to communicate the passion which they're expressing in the story. And then we can help them with the occasional grammatical glitch, which even the best writer has, and it's more really about being able to convey that intensity. Yeah.
No, I mean, I totally agreed. I think mental health, for example, has been so much in the news of
Yes.
late because of isolation and people
Yes.
being on their own.
Yes.
And so when you're looking at, I think you did talk a little bit about the lens that you employ when you're lightly editing
Mhm.
people's works. Um, But you did mention, like, the themes that interest you actually also go back into the selection process, both topical and the themes, like, that stay over a period of time. And, one of the things that is striking in your work as well is this inner landscape of women, where they are trying to find their path, or they are, as you said, like, thwarted in the paths that they're on. So, what of the woman's journey is of interest to you, and how do you see it, and how do you? I mean, is there a message that you want to create? Is there like a larger dialogue that you want people to have through the selection of stories that you put out there?
Mhm. Thank you for that. I was I think at one of the Bangalore Lit Fest some years ago, and Paul Zachariah, who's a fantastic writer, writes in Malayalam and in English from Kerala. He said that it's the writer has the responsibility to give a message. um, I think that's true and not true, in the sense, I think essentially yes, what you're saying is being read and it's part of the fabric of what's in the communal space from then on. And so you have some responsibility, but it's also a very intimate process. It's also very much a process about the inner being. And I think that sometimes you cannot frame it in terms of a message. You just have to let it emerge in terms of what you're feeling and sensing. And I don't think that's in conflict with what Paul Zacharias said, but I'm just sort of rephrasing it in my own terms. Um, so I think that it's terribly critical in a way to, as I said, I return to the terms integrity, honesty, words like that. It's terribly critical to express what you sense, not necessarily you, not the story's not always about you as a writer, but what your character is feeling or experiencing or expressing. And so I'm sort of losing track of your question and evolving in but I think the point is really that you asked about how you create that inner space and what it is that what the most important things are that inform one as a writer or me as a writer.
Mhm.
And I think it's one of those things that is about um, the space of women in society, the place of women in society, and whether you come from, and perhaps not even necessarily women, just human beings in society, but whether you come from privilege or from wealth or from um, oppression, I think the difficulties that one faces in one's personal life are often intense and important, and that you gain some clarity when you try to analyze them and express them through story. And so I think those are the things that are often coming out about essentially, yes, women and their relationship to family, to children, to the responsibilities to next generations, all of those things, but also just in a way of making sense of just what it's all about, living in community, you know. And I think it's what's interesting is people often say, does a fiction matter? I was recently moderating a panel of stories which were about plurality and pieces which were just not necessarily short fiction, but short pieces, poetry, essays, short stories, and so on, about plurality. And someone said, the question was, does it make a difference? I mean, does your little bit of work make a difference? And I believe it does, because the minute you have the work that's being read, however small a community, it changes mindsets a little bit. Just not necessarily through a message, but just because it opens you to another possibility. And I think that is somehow the power of writing. And I think that through examining the place of mainly women in this fabric of life, I think that all of those things have, I mean, for example, in this anthology, we open with Shashi Deshpande's story, which is about the three princesses of Kashi in the Mahabharata, Amba, Ambika, and Ambalika. And they certainly had a very, perhaps one could say, in the larger scheme of things, they were serving a purpose, but as individuals, their lives were so profoundly what they had to go through. And I feel that by even allowing somebody to read that and question the myth, you know, you're serving, in a sense, a purpose and a message. So, yeah.
So two things are coming to mind, Indra, and I think this is from the perspective of somebody who writes novels and long form fiction. I mean, often there is a choice of do you want to entertain or do you want to have a message? And I mean, often you want to actually entertain, but you need to make people reflect. So is that is reflection really the outcome that you want from your readers? perhaps. And I think the second question was, I think the lens that you're adopting. Actually, let's just pause on that. Is it about what's the
Entertainment.
reaction? What is it that you want the reader to do? If it's not really a message, but really there's an outcome to it, right?
Yes.
So what's that outcome that you hope the story has?
Yes. Well, it's interesting you asked that because I remember some years ago, maybe 10 years ago, something, I think all of us have read light entertainment fiction to take our minds off things as we watch escapist movies now on Netflix, what have you. And so I remember some years ago, there was a call somebody saw in the newspaper. My mother saw in the newspaper, and she said, "Oh, Mills and Boon is saying they're going to pay this huge amount of money if you can write a good Mills and Boon novel." And I was like, yes, this is going to be my chance to become a millionaire. I'm going to become the next Barbara Cartland or whoever it would be. But it takes an awful lot of skill to be able to write that kind of entertainment too. So while we take it lightly, it also really requires a lot of skill. And I think the purpose of something like that, which is to make you feel happy and make you feel there's closure and make you feel that love is everything and you can walk away and life is perfect after that. That's so nice. I mean, one shouldn't, of course, live in that illusion, but I think that's wonderful to be able to do that. And I envy people who can because I can't, because of course I could never finish that Mills and Boon novel to answer that call. Um, but I think what happens as you get more seriously into writing, or at least I did, is yes, you certainly do want to entertain in the sense that you want your craft to be good enough that people feel they want to read it, even if it's sometimes demanding. Um, but so you don't want to be sloppy. But on the other hand, yes, perhaps what interests you now is no longer the happy closure, but the ability to convey something that you're thinking about these many injustices, which are endless. You don't want people also to fall into despair reading your work. I mean, there's enough that buffets us from every side. And so, and I suppose, especially with the media being, in a way, thank goodness, exposing us to so much, but it also sometimes gives you no relief from the tensions that are out there.
Mhm.
And so it's not that you want necessarily to be a negative person in your writing, but you do have to balance that ability to craft your story and what it is saying with something that you are thinking and reflecting upon, and somehow what the reader will get out of the work. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's it's that pause, right? As they say, it's a pause which is sort of loaded with
Yes.
your own understanding, of the world around you, right?
Yes.
uh, I think the other thing that happens often is that writing tends to be very cathartic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think earlier what you were alluding to perhaps was this, that when you're trying to live through or imagine the reality around you
Mm-hmm.
and make sense of it, perhaps it is a cathartic moment as well, or is it to say
Um,
that
yes.
there's a complexity of emotions that you feel, right,
Yes.
about the world around you, and
Yes.
does it help
Well,
to?
I'm going to turn to the anthology now to sort of try and answer that. There's a story almost at the end. There are two stories which are very powerful towards the end of the book. One is by a Gujarati writer called Dalpat Chauhan, translated by Hemang Desai, and it's called Home. And he's a Gujarati Dalit writer, and it's about a person in a village trying to find his own home, or to build his own home, which he can afford to do more or less now, but the societal structure doesn't allow it. And so there, I think, um, I don't know whether it was cathartic for Dalpat Chauhan, but I think by forefronting that, by just bringing that story out, it's terribly powerful. You are you are talking about something that is affecting your life, and I think that surely has an impact on the way you think and engage with the injustices in your life. The other one I'm thinking of is Mustansir Hussain Tarar's um, story called Baba Bagloos, which is um, commenting on the hanging of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. And he's a Pakistani writer who lives in Lahore. It's translated by Raza Naeem from Urdu. And again, there, I mean, the experience of having lived through that social event where the public gathered to watch the hanging of a man who had been their leader, I think you can't close your eyes to it just like that. And so the way he writes the story is from the point of view of a kind of a crazy prisoner who's been stuck in this prison forever, and then one day sort of wanders out, is somehow led away from the prison and gathers at this place where this hanging is taking place, and how the public are just responding with a frenzy to this hanging and what's motivating them. And I think there that surely, again, I don't know if it's a cathartic experience, but it's something that if you live through and you're sensitive and you have the ability to write, you write about it, in different ways. And so, yes.
It's so much a commentary upon the world.
Yes.
Hoping that people who didn't observe it the first time around actually pause and observe it.
Yes.
in its rendition as a story.
Yes. And I'm thinking of a third story also, which is, there are many, I love all these stories, I have to say. But the third story is by a writer called Annam Manthiram. She lives in the US, on the west, somewhere on the West Coast side, somewhere, I don't know exactly where. And she obviously is part of the diaspora, so, is very much aware of Indian ways of life. And it's about a process of bride viewing. And it's about a young woman whom people come to see, and she's getting older and older, and nobody accepts her as a bride. And how she's just peeling away layers of herself through this process. And again, that is such a powerful thing, because in a sense, that whole idea of bride viewing, where you're putting yourself up on for show, and who are you in that process, right? So that's something that's she's written about very powerfully.
And it's amazing how some of these things do not change,
right?
Despite education, despite media, despite the turn of time, things remain the same.
Exactly. Yes.
I think let's talk a little bit about this role of the writer as a social being.
Mm-hmm.
Because today you have to, typically writers have been solitary, reflective individuals. The work had to speak for itself. But today the writer has really got to be out there, market themselves, be on social media. So what's your take on it? How do you manage it? Obviously you run a digital platform, so you've been digitally minded and digitally present for a very long period of time, but from a marketing perspective, what's your thought?
Yes, well, before I say anything, thank you for having me. So that's really great to be out here on a platform which has such wide viewership, and also I think it's so important that you run a platform for stories about women who are creating something, who are making something happen. And I think that's inspiring for everyone, but it also allows a space for people to engage and talk, and for the community to gain strength. So it's really important. So thank you very much for that. Yes, it's a very tough world right now, because in a way you do have to be present, and you do have to think about your work, which is exciting actually, but you do have to be able to think about your work to communicate it. My failing, of course, is that I'm not active enough on social media. I think I have. But I look at my kids or their friends or even the younger editors at Out of Print, and I think, oh dear, I'm taking one step when they're taking 20. They're so quick. But I think it's all right. I think there is a lot of onus on the writer to actually engage with their books, but that's not entirely new, because I do remember in earlier times people used to do book tours. Writers used to do book tours and go around from city to city and read from their work and talk to people. So there is that tradition always of using the writer, who is ultimately perhaps a very fine spokesperson for their own work, to speak about the work. And it is awfully exciting. I do remember when we moved back to Mumbai, as I told you, we had lived abroad for many years, and we moved back to Mumbai, and various writers were coming to Crosswords at the time to speak. And it was lovely. I was starting to write and then to go and talk to people, ask a question, but also learn about their process of working. It is exciting. And so in that sense, the digital platform, I think, even though it's harder work maybe for a writer to promote her or his book, I think it is really wonderful that you can reach a very wide audience, and it isn't just that one moment; it's there, and so people can go back and look at it. Yeah,
absolutely. Long tail counts for a lot digitally.
That's right. But it is also hard work. You do wish you had somebody who, sort of do it all for you.
Yeah. So, Indra, it's been we've chatted for an hour, and I know we could go on for. Yeah. But as we are reaching towards the end of the segment, I think a couple of questions. Mm-hmm. One is, what is your advice to the listeners and the viewers today, many of whom may be aspiring authors, many of whom may be professional women wanting to write. So what would you advise them?
I would say, if you want to write, write. And there are so many platforms in which to find expression for your writing. Take, I think, advice mentor yourself in a way by reading a lot of work in the style that you like to write. I think, respect the writers who've gone before, respect the writers who are writing contemporarily, so that you can gain and strengthen your craft, really, and make time for that writing when you want to, or whatever creative output you want to produce, be it writing or painting or embroidery, what have you. Make time for it, because or cooking, make time for it, because that creative aspect of one's life is so enriching personally. It builds community, and I think it's terribly important for the well-being of all of us in the ways we think and ways in which we interact with each other. So do keep writing, and look for good platforms like Out of Print. Yes.
Fantastic. So as we wrap up, what do you think? How what's one inspiring or a few inspiring messages that you would like to leave for young women out there beyond writing?
Beyond writing.
Yeah.
I think you have to be strong. I think essentially that's it. You have to be strong and true to yourself. And often you don't know what that being true to yourself is, because finding yourself is also part of the journey. It's part of the art and the craft of being a human being in today's world. So I think you have to be strong, you have to be empathetic, and you have to really believe in yourself. Self-doubt strengthens one. It creates complexity. It makes you think about things. It makes you investigate. But then you also have to believe in yourself and be strong to that. And it's not easy. You just keep doing it, and that's the way to do it. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Indra. It's been a lovely conversation, and hope to hope to meet you again sometime soon in a different setting.
Thank you. You've been a fantastic host with fantastic questions, made me think, made me articulate many of the things I think about but haven't articulated. And really, it's a privilege to have a lovely host like you. And now I'm going to do the very thing you asked me about, which is how do you go about promoting your books? And I'm going to say, buy these books.
Absolutely.
And thank you to Context and Amazon Westland for connecting me with Winning Minds. I'm most grateful to you.
Thank you, Indra.
Thank you very much.
And with that, we wrap up today. Thank you so much, everybody. Bye.